critique of how it works and how it might or might not be changed. Dame Sue Owen is a former civil servant whose roles include having served as permanent secretary at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. She has in the past served as a member of, I think, 3 of the government's honours committees, covering the arts and media, economy and sport. Sir Peter Riddell is a long-time associate of the Constitution Unit and has done important recent work with us on constitutional standards. He's a former journalist, director of the Institute for Government and Commissioner of Public Appointments. He's also, crucially in this context, a former member of the government's Parliamentary and Political Service Honours Committee, something he did from 2012 to 2016 under David Cameron's premiership. And then last but not least, Dominic Grieve was the Conservative MP for Beaconsfield from 1997 to 2019 and is a former Attorney General for England and Wales. He recently chaired the UK Governance Project, which made numerous recommendations for improvements to our system of government, including proposing changes to the honours system. So we greatly look forward to hearing from all of our panellists. Each of them will start with about 5 minutes of opening remarks, after which we'll have some brief discussion as a panel before opening up to audience questions. Those of you listening live on Zoom can submit your question by using the Q&A function, and my colleague Lisa James, who joins us here on screen, will select from among them and put questions to the panellists. You can choose, if you wish, to submit your question anonymously, otherwise she will by default share your name. One last comment is that this whole session, including the Q&A session, is being live streamed, recorded, and will be available afterwards as a video on the Constitution Unit's YouTube channel and as an episode of our podcast. So you may want to bear that in mind when deciding whether to anonymise your question. But that's plenty from me. Let me pass over to our fantastic panel, starting with Sue.
Well, thank you very much. I was on those 3 committees from 2013 to 2019, so I went to many meetings. As you say, there are 2 rounds each year for New Year and birthday, and generally those are considered, the nominations to each of those are considered several months in advance, and the whole thing is coordinated by the Cabinet Office Honours Secretariat. So the nominations that come in from the public are considered by 10 subject committees such as economy, education, health, science and technology, and so on. And those are made up of an independent chair for each and independent members. Each of those committees is also attended by some permanent secretaries of the relevant departments, and there's also a representative from number 10 invited to attend each as well. But the kind of voting is done by the independent subject committees. So each committee for each round will get a wad of paper kind of this thick with nominations at each level, at knight and dame, at commander level, officer and member level. And for each one, there are far more nominations than there are allocations. So each committee will have an allocation of a number of awards that they can make at each level. So, for example, the Economy Committee would have about 12 to 15 available at knight and dame. The Arts and Media would usually have about 6 to 8. The Sport Committee would only have 1 a year, so that was like half for each one. So that could sometimes get a bit tricky if, in the unlikely event, we had won the Ashes or whatever. So there are numbers at each level, and you basically, it takes a whole day. You go through all the nominations at each level. There are a few extra left over, which all the nominations from each committee then go to a main committee, and that is comprised of the chairs of each of the 10 committees, plus the cabinet secretary and another senior civil servant. And they will review all the nominations from all of the 10 committees, and they usually have a few extra. So for a kind of pool, So if there were an exceptional year where something really amazing had happened, like perhaps after COVID, where they wanted to give far more at one level than, say, the health committee had, they would be able to have some slots from the pool. So it's the main committee that will determine the final allocation. Um, in each case, there are other things that have to be considered, like whether people have paid their tax, or if HMRC is in dispute with somebody being nominated, it's very unlikely that they will be successful in that round. They will also check on whether there's anything, any kind of skeleton in anyone's cupboard that could create difficult reputational kind of issues. So finally, just to be clear, I mean, the nominations largely come from the public. They are there for public service in each kind of subject area. Work for charity is also looked on favourably. Sometimes the committees will want back before the meeting and think a little bit about the sort of past allocation of awards and whether there are significant people that have been somehow missed over the years. So that might happen in football, for example, or sports. But sometimes too in arts and media, if some pop star.
Just losing Sue's sound here a bit. Looks like.
So I think I'll just leave it there.
I'm very sorry. We missed quite a chunk of what you said there. You were talking about significant people who'd been missed over the years, and then you rather froze. So maybe you could say it again.
It wasn't a big point. If you get a nomination for say a footballer or a pop star or an author, the committee may say, have we considered all the people over the past few years who might be deserving of this? And it may then be the case that at the next round, they look for perhaps a nomination for significant people who somehow or other have never been nominated.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. And sorry to make you repeat
That's
there.
okay.
And I think I'm going to save most of my questions until after others have spoken. But just to clarify on the numbers, we're talking about roughly 1,000 a year across the whole system. Would that be about right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Terrific.
the number of nominations will be triple that.
Yeah. 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 So that gives people a sense of the scale of the thing. Now we're going to move on, I think, and talk about aspects of the system which often are the ones which occupy the news, which is talking about the political honours, which are far less numerous, but we hear much more about them. And we're going to pass over to Peter.
No, exactly, Meg. That what Sue's described is kind of 95% of the system. And I was involved serving on the Parliamentary and Political Service Honours Committee with some which got most attention, but actually numerically was tiny. The committee actually was set up by David Cameron, and its remit. Just to repeat one point you make, it was nothing to do with the House of Lords. That's a totally separate thing, and it's important. You've done lots of work on it to view it separately. Nor was it to do with things like being made a Privy Councillor, which is not an honour; it's basically a duty. And even though it was abused by prime ministers and party leaders to make it an honour, it isn't an honour technically. So we were doing exactly the same list as Sue's described. It was MPs. It was members of devolved legislatures. In my day, it was members of the European Parliament, staff at Westminster and the devolved bodies, also those which are responsible to Parliament, like the Ombudsman and the National Audit Office, party workers, very important area, councillors and others working for local government, which I think tended to be neglected. The committee consisted, and this is where it's very different from what Sue's described. We had the three party chief whips, which was an interesting experience seeing them in action, I assure you. I mean, those remembering Francis Urquhart in Michael Dobbs' novel would not be disappointed. And there were 4 independent members. In my time, the independent members were a former cabinet secretary, a former Speaker of the Lords, a former Treasury Officer of Accounts, and myself. Now, independence, I see, has been slightly differently defined because it includes both a Labour peer and a Lib Dem peer, which raises my eyebrows a bit. The chair, however, tends to be from the party in government. In my time, it was Michael Spicer, then it became Stephen Sherborne, and it's now Rosie Winterton, who actually was on the committee when I was on it because she was the Labour chief whip. The nominations, as Sue said, can come from anyone, but crucially, a lot of the key ones in this case came particularly of MPs and so on, came from the chief whips. Sure. And although we did have an interesting period, because this was a period of Speaker Bercow, where he had some interest in the procedure, which didn't always tally with that of the Conservative chief whip at the time, and that produced some entertainment and so on. Now, as Sue says, there's allocations. In our case, we had 4 Ks or damehoods per honours list, so it's 80 a year. And what happened was a kind of rough and ready system of allocating between the parties plus parliamentary staff. I mean, if there was a clerk of one or two, or the clerk of the Commons or the clerk of the Parliaments of the Lords retiring, they counted, or someone else. So we divided it up in a rough and ready way, and I thought it was reasonably fair on that. There are a number of considerations. One is that honours, on the whole, go to people at the end of their careers or after an enormous achievement. I mean, as Sue said, after the Olympics or COVID or something like that, when it's been a big achievement. However, the parties tended to, there was an element of long service, and we did look for people, backbenchers who'd been chairs of select committees or deputy speakers or things like that. But there was a tendency of the parties to want to reward people in post. There were 2 really big problems, which we perhaps discuss later. One was we spent most of our time discussing the top honours, because those were people we knew on the committee and we could take a view. For party workers and others, getting the other honours, they were nominated by the parties, but frequently the chief whips hadn't a clue who they were. And so it was a very arbitrary process. By that, I don't mean it was biased, but it meant that it purely depended who was nominated. I mean, I felt the parties varied enormously in their efficiency in nominating people. A lot more people would have been considered if the parties had been better at nominating people. And I actually thought that was a bit unfair, not deliberately, but just casually. The other point, and this is the really controversial one, is we were doing this, but Prime Ministers, David Cameron and his successors, retained the right to make political awards separate from the honours list. And you'd have that happening once or twice a year. I mean, one of the bizarre things, sometimes you look through the main lists in the papers at Christmas and New Year and the birthday honours, and they're the clear list. Then sometimes you get 3 knighthoods or damehoods which pop up on a political list, which is completely separate from the allocation I discussed, and that used to infuriate particularly the other members of committees. And so I thought that the Prime Ministers did that also with resignation honours. In theory, the names were run through the committee, but often there wasn't time to do anything serious about it or consider it. So it was basically an override, which left the patronage really with the Prime Minister. I think there's a lot more, but that's what I could say initially anyway.
Thank you very much. There's lots I'd like to ask you about, but I shall resist the temptation because Dominic might even address some of it in what he's going to say, because your group wanted to reform the very process that Peter has just told us about, I believe.
Yes, we did. When we carried out a governance project which looked at a whole series of aspects of the way in which the UK standards and ethics were maintained in government, this was one of the topics we looked at. And I should say at the outset that I think our view collectively of this review group was that we were, for the most part, very happy with the way in which the honours system broadly works. And indeed, that's been my own experience from my time as an MP, because as a Member of Parliament, I used to support or occasionally initiate recommendations for honours of individuals in my constituency whose work had been brought to my attention. And there was also the Lord Lieutenancy, which also operated to do it and would sometimes contact me about one of them. And it always seemed to me that this worked fairly well, and that people were getting honours which recognised the work they'd done within their communities. And looking at public reaction to this as well, my impression is that for the most part, the public are broadly pleased with the way in which the system works. There is, however, the category of political honours. Now, I should be careful what I say as a former politician, but the fact, I don't think politics is a separate strand of public service, and I do think that politicians who perform public service merit honours. And those who are working within the political sphere, whether it may be constituency workers, agents of the local political parties, if they have in fact contributed to the political life of the country, then recognising that is a very good thing. But the thing that we really targeted in this review was essentially the prime ministerial override, the ability of a prime minister to nominate, and so it's in a sense a survival of royal prerogative, but now handed to the prime minister, virtually any honour they wanted to any person they wanted out of the normal sequencing of the process. And as Peter has just pointed out, whilst that may go before a committee before it's signed off, in reality, the Prime Minister has that override capacity. Now, one has to recognise that Prime Ministers have difficult tasks in life, particularly managing their own backbenchers and their own supporters. And the counter-argument that is going to be put forward is that if it enables a Prime Minister to manage a government well, to be able to offer effectively honours to individuals in recognition of their services outside of the system, then why should that be taken away from them? But I do think it has the capacity to bring the system into disrepute. And I also have direct knowledge from my time as a Member of Parliament that it is also used essentially as bait. So promises of honours are made on behalf of Prime Ministers, not usually directly by Prime Ministers, but by others who have their ear and are involved in the political system, saying that an honour would be on its way if only the Member of Parliament would conform a little bit better to the government's view of it, to the government's policies. So it's used as a stick as well as a carrot. And I just don't think really we should have any part of that in our system. And so our recommendations were really to remove that power from the Prime Minister and to consolidate the State and Political Committee as a new central and independent committee, which would be able perhaps best to balance awards for political and public service and control total numbers. It may be, for example, that if the Prime Minister's power of override is removed, it might be worthwhile expanding the number of honours that can be granted to politicians or those involved in public service at the New Year and birthday honours, a recognition of the reality that, in fact, there are honours coming from another direction. But I think that what it would principally do is to enable there to be greater public confidence that these are not just being offered out as baubles to keep people sweet, which I don't think is what the honours system should be doing. Peter rightly highlighted the fact that, of course, privy councilorships, which is something which I do have, are not within that part of the system. They should not really be given out as honours at all. You're a member of the Privy Council because there is a need for it, and that is essentially if you're a member of the Cabinet or you're involved at a high level in Cabinet activity, which is why law officers or the Attorney General is always made a Privy Councillor on appointment, and of course there are others as well. But it shouldn't really be offered as a reward. It is, because occasionally it's chairs of committees who don't have actually a need for it, who get it at the end of their service. That may be fairly innocuous, but I think it can also be doled out by Prime Ministers simply as another bauble within their armoury of baubles, if I can use that particular mixed metaphor, in order to enable government to take place. And we also recommended that the detailed criteria for nominations should be done. Now, in many cases, it's perfectly obvious as to how and the reasons why behind a nomination and the decision to grant an honour, but a little bit more information might not come amiss. And if I may say so, just listening to Sue today provided the greater transparency about the nomination process, which otherwise, I think if you're outside of the system, you wouldn't actually know how it operates. And there really is no reason why that shouldn't be publicised more. I cannot see a reason why the public shouldn't have an understanding of the committee structures that go into doing this. And I think they would approve it. So those are really our recommendations. We obviously also made recommendations about the House of Lords. I'll only say this, the House of Lords, again, should be appointments to do a job. But the reality, and we know it, is that in many cases it's being used by prime ministers and indeed leaders of the opposition to reward people with an honour, and in fact their participation thereafter in the life of the House of Lords is often rather restricted. And that is something too which ought to be addressed, but it's a rather different subject.
Thank you very much, Dominic. And yes, these two do seem to get rather muddled up in terms of resignation honours lists, which start jumbling up peerages with the wider honours given by the Prime Minister. And I guess your proposal to end the Prime Minister's direct route would end all of that, would end resignation honours, would end resignation peerages.
Yes, resignation honours would go as well. So again, the Prime Minister would be fully entitled to make it clear, to make a list submission to the Honours Committee saying, I have now resigned. This is the end of my tenure, and I would like you to consider the following people who I think merit recognition for the service they gave to my government. And I would hope that that would have considerable influence on the committee, particularly if it were provided with reasoned examples of it, and that some of those people would then proceed to get it. But it wouldn't be an automatic hand in the list and eventually it just gets given.
Thank you very much. I'm very keen that I will try, I may fail, but I'm very keen that at this seminar, we don't also eclipse the 95% of the system that Sue has been talking about that people seem primarily to be positive about by constantly slipping into talking about the political honours. But this is the Constitution Unit, so we may fail. But I'd like to bring us back to the stuff that Sue was talking about, which you had very little time to describe a large and complex system. I read in preparation for this, and I totally agree with what Dominic just said. There's very little information out there. There is stuff on the government website, obviously. There are some House of Commons library briefings, but it's quite hard to get to grips with exactly how the system works. So I agree that that material could be more readily available. But one of the things that I learned was about the Royal Commission on Honours in 1922, which concluded that the system largely was working well. The problem was the political honours. And it seems that 103 years later, we might be still having the same conversation. So looking at the main system, which everybody says is, that's the part that's working well, are there nonetheless improvements that could be made? Is there room for modernisation? Is there anything particular you would point to?
Well, I think, there have been some attempts to get some balance on diversity issues like gender and ethnicity, and making sure that the devolved administrations put nominations in and so on. And there was, in fact, there still may be a separate committee that kind of overlooks all of that. I think for me, one of the problems was that some areas were very good at nominating. So take the universities, for example. The LSE was extremely good at nominating people, and we'd always get some from there. But there were very deserving academics in other areas where nobody had thought to nominate them. So much more publicity about putting nominations in. I mean, again, the ones that the public see a lot, of course, are the sport and the arts and media. In sport, you always wanted to try and get a balance of very popular sports and more day-to-day sports. And some of the people on the committee themselves, some of the independent people, did do quite a bit of work with sports associations, encouraging them to nominate people, yeah, very often at the more junior levels. In arts and media, it was quite a business because you had nominations from music, theatre, dance, poetry, writing, architecture, opera, film, artists, TV and media, and so on. And some of those areas were again better at nominating than others. We did have a rule that no serving journalists should get an honour. No, nobody until they had retired. So there were one or two gates like that. But from, very often people would say to me, why hasn't so and so got an honour? And it's like, well, have you nominated them? And the nomination, there is a form, you can download it. You fill it in, you say what the person has done, you if they've done any charity work, you'd want to mention that. And then it's quite important to get letters of support from other people who might know that candidate and who can put in letters of support, which the Cabinet Office will then coordinate and put through all the committees. So basically, I'd say, yeah, more ordinary nominations, please.
And it seemed, I was thinking this when you were speaking about the sports people. I mean, both the things that you and Peter said. Actually, no, let me stop before I ask another question and say, members of the audience, please send in your questions, because I failed to remind you before starting on my own questions. We've had some in, but we would like some more. Now is your opportunity, because we'll turn to audience questions maybe in about 10 minutes, and we'd like to gather some in. So please go ahead. And now I have to remember where I was. Yes. So both you and Peter were talking about this sort of interesting balance between the extent to which you're driven by the nominations and the extent to which you're able to act strategically as a committee. And when you were talking about the sports people, and also when Peter was talking, I was thinking there's a degree of accident here as to whether you sort of retire or win a race or something in a busy year, which must be a challenge. But also whether you can sort of steer a bit more strategically. To what extent are you on the sports people and so on, and the people from the arts? So it sounds like we're not so much talking about ordinary public nominations. We're talking about quite a professionalized process. We're not looking for me to nominate the person who won Wimbledon because I thought they were great. We're looking for somebody else to do that very often in these situations, I guess.
Well, there's an important role there for the chair of the committee. So Seb Coe, for example, was chair of sport for some of the time while I was on it. And he was very good at meeting outside of the committees with the other independent chairs and trying to go through, the different sports and maybe get the FA in football or the ECB for cricket or so on to do some nomination themselves. And then, of course, in sport in particular, you had to think a bit ahead about, what would you do if England won the World Cup? Would the captain get an OBE and would everybody else get an MBE? And what about all the reserves? Would they count? I mean, they would think through some rules like that. On arts and media, again, a good chair will be trying to work behind the scenes in between the nominating rounds to try and bring forward some good nominations. For economy, obviously, that's a massive committee and has people from all over. And again, the committee itself will try and do some work behind the scenes, certainly for the kind of the knights and dames and the CBs and so on. I mean, just one thing we haven't mentioned before is that there are kind of different classes. So the Empire group is the biggest, but there are other things like there's the Order of the Bath, which is mainly for civil servants and military people. And then there's the Order of St. Michael and St. George, which is mainly for foreign Foreign Office people and the development community and that kind of thing. So those departments will be looking out for nominating their staff, but those are much smaller groups than the British Empire category.
Thank you.
Can I
Peter, yeah.
Meg, on that? I mean, recognizing exactly what Sue said, but one thing I'd reinforce is, of course, the Honours Secretariat is tiny. They are overstretched. They're coping, as she rightly said, with thousands of names, trying to assess them, try to do their head. It's really done on a shoestring. I mean, and also when you mentioned strategy, I thought our idea of strategy on the Political Honours Committee was perhaps we'll refer it to, if it was a birthday honour, oh, well, it won't get in this list, but what about it at Christmas, for the New Year's honours list? So there was no other sense of strategy at all. And a lot of it was actually because reactive. But my concern, echoing a point Sue made, was that it was, as I said earlier, it was arbitrary for party workers who was nominated and who wasn't. And I did feel quite often there that people who've been working out entirely depended on the nature of the party machines, whose support they had, and so on. And it was not biased, but it was just unfair in that respect. And I thought that certainly could be dealt with. But it is a problem when you've got a tiny secretariat trying to process all this, and that didn't make life easy at all in that way. And one thing Sue mentioned, the British Empire thing. I always felt that you could retain the CB and make it British excellence. I felt that it is a strange thing to have empire in it, or it's just you could retain it very simply, and the proliferation of different classes, as you said, both civil service, military, etc., etc. There's also the sovereign's own one, the Royal Victorian Order. It is. I don't think anything will happen, and the only people who really know anything about it are those who are operating the system and those who get an honour in that way. So I do think there's something which slightly raises an eyebrow there. But the main thing is ensuring a much greater range of nominations, and that I think is a real problem.
Yeah, Peter, you've raised something that I was going to raise, not at this point, but let me follow up now because you have raised it about the empire moniker. This has been under debate for potential reform for at least 20 years. I think in 2004, the Public Administration Select Committee of the House of Commons suggested that it should be changed to the Order of British Excellence. That was after Benjamin Zephaniah had turned down because he didn't want to carry the name empire. We don't have an empire anymore. Should this happen, and what is the obstacle to it happening? Why does it not happen?
The process is a very conservative one, involving the palace, and the people involved in it are small c conservative. There are many virtues in such attitudes, but I feel no one wants to create a fuss, is the argument. And which prime minister is going to the king, and of course the king would have to be involved, and saying, look, I'd like to change this. Certainly I doubt if the current prime minister in the current position would do that. The time to start is at the beginning of a parliament, I feel.
Yes. Okay, interesting. Do either of the other two, either Dominic or Sue, want to comment on that point? Because it's quite a central one. You don't have to.
I certainly would be perfectly happy to see it changed to the Order of British Excellence. I can't see a reason why it shouldn't. And there is an issue about overseas territories, and there are some other Commonwealth countries that still make use of it, and that may also contribute to the inertia. But on the whole, I think it would be much better if it were to move. The other thing we haven't touched on is about automatic honours. It is just worth mentioning in passing that there are some posts which automatically carry honours, and particularly it's High Court judges and appointments to the High Court bench. There used to be more. For example, attorneys general were always, and solicitors general were always knighted on appointment. And the reason behind that was the view that, in fact, it went with the job, and that if it was held out as a carrot when they were fulfilling that job, it was a bad idea because it might affect their judgment. John May, and also Lord Mayors of the City of London used to get knighthoods on appointment. That all went in a reform carried out by John Major, but he was persuaded that he couldn't do it for judges because that would create inequality in high judicial office, which was regarded as being undesirable. And so they are the one group, I think, that have kept the knighthood on appointment. All the others have gone.
Yeah. Could I just, on that, to reinforce that, and is that there are now fewer in the civil service. It's often alleged that senior civil servants will get them automatically. That's no longer in any way true. As long-serving, distinguished people like Sue do, but it's many fewer than used to be.
Thank you. Having said that, I didn't want this to be dominated by political honours. I'd like to ask one question about political honours before we turn to the audience, which is, in a sense, the politics of these reform proposals and the party politics of the system. Doing my reading in advance, I see that Tony Blair announced that he wouldn't be making any direct appointments as Prime Minister, and Gordon Brown did the same. And then David Cameron reintroduced the direct route. And I think it has probably been used increasingly in recent years, and increasingly controversially, given the resignation honours list, most obviously of Boris Johnson. Is there a party politics to this? And does the current government have a position on it? Should we expect any change from the current government? And would there be a way of doing what Tony Blair, it seemed to me, was trying to do, which was to close down the Prime Minister's direct route, but to close it down permanently? Because clearly it wasn't enough. A future government just changed the practice again. Dominic, do you want to start with that? And then maybe Peter would like to comment.
I think you're right. I think David Cameron reverted with his patrician approach to government to a traditional system of being able to hand it out as potential rewards. I'm not sure that's a very desirable thing to happen. Yes, it has become, I think, abused and become much more visibly abused with the passage of time. But I no idea what the current Labour government's approach or attitude to this is.
Peter?
Well, they've been making political awards, and that's certainly come through. So I don't sense, and also if you look at the makeup of the Parliamentary Political Services Honours Committee, it's very much a more party and a less independent one than the one I served on. So I don't necessarily sense that. And more to the point, I don't have any sense at all it's a priority. I mean, as you in a different area may see with the House of Lords Appointments Committee, there is no appetite for changing structures in there or in other things. It just doesn't seem to appeal to them. The other point, I mean, interesting reinforcement on it is, of course, neither Tony Blair nor Gordon Brown had resignation honours lists.
Yeah.
Although they did create a lot of peers. And
one of the concerns, I think I expressed this publicly when Johnson's list was published and honoured by Rishi Sunak, was that actually it brings the wider system that Sue was talking about. There feels an air of sort of disrepute about it, and people might not be so comfortable accepting honours if they feel they're in bad company.
I mean, I think you draw the line between peerages and other honours.
Yes,
that's the key.
But some of those resignation honours were not peerages.
Indeed, absolutely.
They were other honours, and there were controversies about COVID parties.
And also, to reinforce Dominic's point, a departing Prime Minister can say, look, these people worked for me. The trouble is, some of the resignation honours list is people didn't work for him at all. It's just rewarding friends, allies, and so on. I mean, there's no particular connection with actually having worked in Downing Street.
We have had lots of audience questions come in since my appeal for audience questions. So I'd like to invite Lisa to come back onto the screen, and let's start grouping them and getting through as many of them as we can. There's lots of really interesting questions. Over to Lisa.
I have answered a few of them online.
Yes, people may want to check the answers tab to see some of their questions answered on how the system works. But there is, I think, a real hunger to understand a little bit more about the ins and outs of this. So we're going to start with a round of questions, looking at a little bit more how the process works at the moment. So an anonymous attendee asks, given there isn't a lot of information online, what makes a good nomination? What are the committees looking for? And on a related note, Craig Cross asks, what are the criteria for different levels of OBE, MBE, BEM, etc.? And a quick factual one, for those nominations for someone in the civil service, does that count as part of the political cohort or the non-political system? We'll leave it there for now.
Good questions. Should we start with Sue?
Yes, well, on the last question, the civil servants would go to the state committee, so that is a separate one, and they may get Empire or Bath or St Michael and St George ones, but those are considered by an independently chaired committee as well. I mean, on what makes a good nomination, it has to be very clear what the contribution the person has made, and preferably it needs to be for real public service, and again to document sort of exactly what they've done and what else they've done for charity and so on. In terms of the levels, the Cabinet Office will usually, the Honours Secretariat will make their judgment as to what the kind of appropriate level is. So if it's something someone's done that is had more of a kind of local impact, that's more likely to be an MBE level. If it's a more significant national impact, that might be more at C level. But it's a question of judgment that they make. I mean, sometimes at the actual committee, if someone is really deserving and there just aren't enough slots at that kind of level, the committee might say, look, this is a really, really good person. Perhaps we should put that in at OBE rather than CBE. But sometimes it happens the other way, that you'll get a nomination at MBE that people think actually that should be an OBE. So I think it's reasonably fair, and people can look online. The Cabinet Office website has got the composition of all the committees and all the members, and when people apply for these jobs, some heed is taken of trying to get a kind of geographical balance, making sure that the devolveds aren't ignored and so on. So I think the balance of the committees is reasonably good, actually.
Just one brief thing to add to that. For what they describe as the higher honours, they do publish the citations now in detail. It's not just a two-line thing. It's now a kind of lengthy paragraph explaining why someone's got it. I mean, I don't say it's the most objective thing I've ever read in my life, but it's there, and so it is clearly there. And they do actually. I mean, it's on the website somewhere. Exactly the point Sue's making: local, national, and so on. Obviously, there's a big subjective element into these. It's not like doing an exam or anything like that, but there are clear criteria in that way.
Yeah.
So the good nomination thing, very simply, is to get broad support. Is not just to be nominated by someone who works closely with you, but people who operated in your area, have been affected by you, demonstrating the public service element. So that's a good nomination, is to have lots of independent people, not all from the same organisation, recommending someone.
That's very interesting, Peter, and touches on something actually I was going to ask, so let me throw it in. Not all from the same organisation. How about the same political party? I mean, when you described the political honours, you were talking very much about chief whips and parties putting people in. Is there room for independent-minded people to get through the committee without necessarily the backing of their party leader? Because some of them are the best politicians we have.
That's a really good point, Meg. We tended to, on the committee, actually, if someone had been independent-minded, actually to look for if provided they met the other criteria, they weren't just a kind of rent-a-quote maverick, but if they'd actually been chair of a committee or something like that. No, they were taken seriously, and certainly that was the virtue of having the independent members, because in the dynamics of the committee, the parties worked together. The three chief whips were working hand in glove. That's why I said it was a bit like Francis Urquhart and House of Cards, because they were working together. So the independent members were in many respects a balance to the chief whips. And certainly we would, if someone had genuinely made a contribution and they were independent minded, I certainly, and the other independents viewed them favourably. We wouldn't just say, well, they're a loyal party spokesman. But of course, for party workers, the only people who could nominate really would be the parties, because they're the only people who know about them. The other thing I'd say is party staff and the clerks of the Parliament were very efficient at looking after people who worked in Westminster.
Yeah. Talking of independent-minded politicians, do you want to add anything on this round, Dominic, or should we go back to Lisa?
No, I think probably go back to Lisa. My experience was that, going back to the times when I was approached to endorse one, is that yes, at local level, I never felt there was a major problem. Occasionally, I mean, I can think of at least one person who I very, very strongly endorsed, and I don't think has ever had any recognition locally, who worked locally. And I was a little bit surprised about that, and remain mystified, in fact. It's right to say that perhaps this is a sensitive subject, but honours are a delicate matter. People are quite reticent. And so you do need, if you're going to get an honour, you need somebody normally who says this really ought to happen. And of course, they don't tell you, and then they go off and they do it. But it's right to say that in some communities in the United Kingdom, it's a bit more upfront than that. And you effectively, people are running around self-nominating and actually trying to sort that out. And whether, in fact, it's warranted or not can be quite problematical. And I suspect is quite a challenge for the committees when it eventually appears in front of them.
I don't know if Sue wants to comment on that or...
Yes, I will comment on that. I mean, there are people who think they're entitled to, particularly Ks, when they've chaired something because the person before them got one. And it doesn't work like that. You have to have been very successful and run the institution well and so on. And if the committee becomes aware that someone's either self-nominated or has been putting other people up, that really counts as quite a black mark. They're less likely to get it if it is known that has been happening. That's not what the system's there for.
Okay, let's go back to Lisa. We might manage a couple more rounds if we're quick, but it depends on how diverse your questions are, really.
Well, my next round is two quite closely related questions. So we've had some questions about the role of the monarchy in all this. So an anonymous attendee has written in to ask, could the panel say a little more about the relationship between the honour system and the popularity and or legitimacy of monarchy? Is the fact of the monarchy being seen to confer society's highest honours a mechanism that sustains or perhaps boosts the monarchy's relevance or legitimacy? Does the panel agree or disagree about this kind of mechanism? And James McConaughey wrote to us earlier on Blue Sky to say, how does and how should the system handle Republicans?
Interesting. Dominic, why don't you go first?
Yes,
on this,
well, of course it does. It's one of the roles of the monarchy. The monarchy is the fount of all honours. And if you believe in the monarchy, it has the advantage that it provides a degree of detachment from politics and political patronage because of the sifting system, if it's working properly. But I accept that with political honours, it isn't, those which are literally handed out by the Prime Minister. And yes, it boosts, it is one of the roles of the monarchy. So as it is part of the monarch's role, it undoubtedly helps boost the monarch's status, one can argue, because it is part of the role, including going to Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle or Holyrood House or wherever the ceremonies are taking place, where the recognition is granted. Can Republicans get honours? Yes, they can. I can think of a number of people who are overt Republicans who have been honoured because they're quite happy to take the honour and accept the honour, even if they may wish to see the system changed. There are one or two countries that don't have honours systems. Ireland doesn't have an honours system at all, which is quite interesting and may be a reaction when Ireland turned into the Free State and then into the Republic. There are no Irish honours, although it's a subject of some debate within Ireland as to whether that's a desirable thing. But a lot of republics have honours systems. The only honour I have is an honour given by the French state, because my role is president of the Franco-British Society. So, and most countries do. But yes, it's intimately linked to monarchy. And as I happen to be a great believer in constitutional monarchy, I see that as a good thing. I suppose if one has a great antipathy to monarchy, then one won't want a system which is associated with the monarch. But then on the other hand, what is the system you're then going to have? Because in any presidential system, like France, for example, it is the president who is ultimately the founder of the honours system, and he is very much a politician.
Sue, Peter, do you have thoughts on these? Interesting questions.
Well, I mean, everybody gets the chance to turn it down. They are written to beforehand, before the list is published. So if anybody doesn't want to be associated, they don't have to accept. Most people do accept. You know, what is not good is to turn it down and then say you turned it down. That's rather frowned upon. But look, I think for all the recipients, it genuinely is an honour, and the actual day is amazing. I mean, I sometimes joke that the honours system is a secret tool of Keynesian economic policy, because everybody needs a new outfit. Their family needs new outfits. You need to pay for photos and a nice lunch afterwards for the people who go with you and extended family. So people typically spend a lot of money on their day at the palace, and generally enjoy it a lot and feel kind of warm about the whole system.
Peter, do you have any contrary
No,
views?
I totally endorse all the above.
Okay, let's go then to what I think will now unfortunately have to be our last round. Lisa.
Thanks, Meg. I'm going to put a couple of questions together on similar themes to try and get in as many people's views as possible. So we've had a couple of questions, one from Simon Hart, one from an anonymous attender, about the effectiveness and the sequencing of the kind of propriety, ethics, tax checks, both suggesting that they have seen places where either the sequencing or perhaps the depth of background check feels like hasn't quite gone to plan. Does the panel have views on how well that works at the moment and whether there are ways it might be improved? And then a reform question to end on: how realistic is it that the system will be reformed on political appointments? It seems to have broad support. Somebody else writes in on the same lines to say, surely the chief whips will fight tooth and nail to keep it as it is.
And perhaps a twist to add to that, which I sometimes add at the end of these sessions, is if people do want reform, what should they be doing? Peter, would you like to go first?
Okay. On the propriety point, that's a really good question. As Sue said, the Secretariat have a look, but because of timing and just the overwhelming weight of work, quite a lot of it happens after it's gone from the subject committee before it's finally approved by the main committee. I remember one case of someone whom the subject committee, the one I was on, approved for a very high honour, and it was the only time we had a vote in my 4.5 years on the committee. We actually had a vote, and it was the whips plus one independent defeating the other independents, and I thought there were ethical problems, and ultimately the person concerned was rejected on ethical, because of propriety checks. But it's just a sheer practical thing of when you do it, and I think there can be problems. But there are, as Sue said, there's tax and there's other things of obviously criminal and any dubious and embarrassment. The more difficult thing is when it's not something as clear cut as that. I remember we had a case of someone who was alleged to have been a bully. And that was a really difficult one, because whose evidence do you take on that? And I think there's some quite difficult things, in a hurried committee when you don't have proper evidence on that. On the point of for reform, I see no appetite or energy for it at present, like many constitutional things at present with the current government.
Sue, would you like to come in maybe on the propriety point, and then I'll end on with Dominic, who I hope might have a more uplifting answer on reform, since he's here to talk about reform. He might have some suggestions about how anything happens.
Well, just quickly, I mean, Peter is right what he said about the flags. Ideally, the flag would have been investigated before the main committee meets, and if the main committee then decides not to take that recommendation forward, it's not always wasted, because most of the committee will have one or two reserves, and the pool that I mentioned So long as the the thing is rejected at the main committee, they can often then pull in someone else to take that place. So obviously, if it comes up after the main committee, that is more unfortunate, and that slot might be wasted then. But in general, it will have been revealed before the main committee.
Thank you. And Dominic, you want reform? How likely is it, and how should people get it if they want it?
Well, I would like to see reform, and the governance project came up with a whole series of reform ideas for an incoming government, which were quite easy to implement. They didn't really require any statutory changes. They required, in some cases, just self-denying ordinances. So this is a very easy area to reform, the one area which I think causes problems for people and also brings it into disrepute. But I listened to what Peter's just said. It hasn't yet happened. I think it would be a very good thing if it did, but will it? And will the chief whips just continue to take the view that this is an area in which they are insistent that they're going to dabble? And I must say that seeing that we are now 18 months into a new government, which said it came in with a desire to transform ethics and standards, it's very sluggish in the way it's approaching it. I can't fail but say that.
Oh, well, maybe we'll reconvene this time next year, or maybe in a summer before a summer round, and we can reflect on whether we were all correct, whether anything has improved, whether reform is on the agenda. But you've emphasised that much of the system does work well, and that it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and think that it's all tarnished because of some dubious appointments that we might hear about. One thing we didn't get to, which I was a bit surprised about, was the potential removal of honours, the forfeiture committee and so on. And I think this would be an opportunity just to say to the audience, if there are things you do want to read, there is more information out there. Have a look on the Cabinet Office website. It does explain the nomination process. Have a look at the House of Commons library briefings, and you'll be able to learn a bit more about things like forfeiture of honours if you want to go further. I think we could have continued this discussion much longer. You've been a really fascinating panel. And we're tremendously grateful to Dominic, Peter and Sue for being with us to discuss these matters. Very grateful to you in the audience, particularly those of you who asked such interesting questions. As I said at the beginning of this session, a video will be posted shortly on the Constitution Unit website and YouTube channel. The audio of this event will become a Constitution Unit podcast. So if you did find it interesting and enlightening or enjoyable, I hope you'll want to encourage other people to listen in afterwards. Our next seminar will ask, can the House of Commons handle multi-party politics, with academic Louise Thompson, former Commons official Paul Evans, and the Green Party's Westminster leader Ellie Chowns. It takes place on the 19th of January at lunchtime. You can register now on our website, and a link has just been dropped into the chat for those of you who can click through quickly. If you want to be sure to hear about all of our upcoming events and publications, do sign up to the Constitution Unit's mailing list if you haven't done already. You can get there via the Get Involved link on our website. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. But with those closing words, that is all from us today. Thank you all for coming, and thank you enormously to our speakers. That was a really interesting session. Okay, goodbye, everybody.